glad that I'm following Heidi because that was a really uplifting, kind of talk, and I want you to hold on to that feeling. And if you have an Advil or a Tylenol that you can pre-take, go ahead and take that now, because I'm an engineer and I'm not as, optimistic or joyful in anything. So I operate Navajo Reservoir. It's one of the Colorado River Storage Project units, along with Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and all the way down to Lake Powell. So I just operate Navajo Reservoir. That's my charge. And I also provide flow forecasting, operations forecasting for the other area reservoirs, including Vicedo, Lemon, ALP, sometimes McPhee if I have time. Ken's on his own, and Jackson Gulch. So my discussion on navigating shortage, and you'll have to forgive me because I also have not given a presentation with people in a couple of years. So all of the eyeballs are drilling into my brain right now. If everybody could just shut your eyes. Okay. All right, this is just a photo I found from a really great article, and it's a mountain in California. I'm just going to kind of start here. How many people in this room have maybe a marker up in the mountains, a snow-tell site, a big tree, a branch, something where you kind of think to yourself, if the snow gets to this level, I know that the reservoir will fill. I know that I can irrigate this much. I know that, the flows will get to, they'll peak at this many CFS on the Animus. Does anybody have like a marker you've used for decades or generations or anything like that, right? So, how many people have noticed that in the last 10 or 20 years, those markers are maybe not quite as accurate as they used to be? You have to think to yourself, if the snow gets to that line, we're going to have 75% of the peak, right? This is something that we've all noticed. This is what we're here to talk about. So it used to be that we would, and by the way, before I get into this, I'm going to be talking about forecasting mostly for operations at the reservoirs. I don't create the flow forecasts. I don't create the weather forecast. That's something that the National Weather Service does, that the Basin River Forecast Centers do. And I use those flow forecasts to forecast operations at reservoirs. So typically when I talk about forecasts, that's what I'm talking about. So it used to be that we would look up at the sky or in the mountains and we would say, oh, there's snow up there. There's this much snow. It's going to provide this much runoff this year. That's great. There are these other factors that go into it. There's soil moisture. There's the phase of precipitation, snow or rain, the timing, the base flow in the river downstream, the ET rates, the temperatures. These are all things that feed into that forecast, but we think about them a little bit less just because they haven't, I guess, changed that much from, years past. Well, now those are becoming very, very big inputs into modeling, into flow forecasting. We're paying a lot more attention to those because as climate change, drought, aridification takes hold, increases, these factors are becoming much bigger uncertainties in all of our flow modeling. So, and land use. So there's an anthropogenic component. So typically, this is another, I only have a couple slides here, but this is a slide from a really good report to Congress that Reclamation put out recently, and it's on different types of snow measurement technologies and how good they are in different senses. And I just like it because it has a really good graphic of kind of the issues that we're dealing with right now with regards to operations and forecasting. So we only have two things we can kind of control. We can't control the weather. We can't control the soil moisture. We can't control how much it snows or rains beyond, attempting to alleviate climate change, obviously. But one thing we can control are the operations at our projects. And then one thing that not we as Reclamation, but, that can be controlled are demands downstream. And because I am a project operator, I'm mostly just focusing on the operations. So those are the things that feed into operations are forecasts. We need a really good forecast. So what goes into a forecast? We have to know the current baseline conditions. We have to know what's on the ground right now. How dry is the soil? how much water are the plants using right now? We have to know all that information, and we have to know it on a continuously temporal and spatial timescale, which is impossible. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of mins and maxes. A lot of you have heard the terms most probable and max probable and min probable. We have a range of forecasts, kind of like what Dr. Bollinger was talking about, where we aren't just counting on one number. When people say, is SWCD going to get 100,000 acre-feet of fill? That's a question I got this morning. I don't know. It could be nothing, or it could be 200. I'm working in a range, right? And I'm planning for all of these possibilities. That's what operating is. It's not operating for one possibility. It's operating for a whole bunch of possibilities. You'll be able to see my little laser pointer, but I'm pointing at the little graph in the middle. This is sort of a little graph of an inflow forecast and the bounds of uncertainty. So early in the season, we have this kind of wide yellow band of uncertainty that's showing that we just don't know how much snow is going to fall this year. As we go through the year, that band gets a lot more narrow towards the end of July, and we have a good idea of how much snow is going to fall. Conversely, the kind of purpley band is very narrow at the beginning of the year because we have an idea of how much snow is on the ground now. We have a fairly good idea of soil moisture, but as we move through the year, those bands get more uncertain. So you would think that by the end of the year, our uncertainty is down to 0. But you can see it's really not. We still have kind of a lot of uncertainty even on July 29 on how much total inflow is going to come into any of our reservoirs. So as climate change increases and increases all of these other factors that are going into our modeling runs, that are going into our actual runoff, our uncertainty is sort of increasing. And the challenge is, can we get enough investment? Can we use enough technology? Can we get under that uncertainty at a greater rate than the uncertainty is increasing? And that's a real challenge. We are getting a lot better, I think, as Dr. Bollinger was talking about. And I'm also talking about operations forecasting. I'm not really talking about the weather forecasting. That's on a different agency. But what we do is we take their forecasts and we're starting to kind of hedge our bets on the drier side. We get a very wide range, most likely based on recent trends. We're going to be really focusing all our energy on those drier forecasts. Well, I've totally derailed. 5 minutes left? I can do it in 2. All right. All right, so the next, I'm going to just show another couple of slides here. It's not just soil moisture decreases in precipitation, increases in temperature. We've seen a lot of that in the last presentations. One of the other things I want to touch on is specifically to the infrastructure that we have, these reservoirs, changing timing, volumes, and states. So as we were talking about in the last session, a lot of the snow now is falling as rain. Well, that's kind of okay if your reservoir has always got a lot of water in it. If you have a reservoir that carries significant carryover storage every year, that's kind of okay. It doesn't really matter when the snow and rain come. In our reservoirs, we are much more concerned with dealing with the day-to-day or year-to-year filling of these reservoirs. So if the rain and the snow come at the wrong time, then our infrastructure patterns are not set up to handle that as efficiently. So this is kind of a typical historical plot of how rain and snow fall and how that affects irrigation in any one year. This is just an illustration. There are no numbers on it. It's just a very, it's just to kind of demonstrate this point. But every month we get some amount of precipitation. In the winter months, typically it's going to fall as snow. You can see the snow graphs there. And then in the kind of transitions, we have some rain and snow in the spring, and then in the fall it turns to rain. And that really lines up with the purpose of the reservoir. We are holding this water back, and we are releasing it in the summer when the base flows drop off and are much lower. So this is sort of an estimate, just an illustration of a warmer, drier future where a lot more of the snow in the winter is falling as rain, elevating those base flows in the winter at a time when nobody's irrigating, nobody's using that water. So it's just, you know, sometimes it's going into the reservoir. If it's below the reservoir, it's just going down to the next reservoir. But nobody's using that water at the time, which means that when we have to irrigate later in the summer, we are releasing a lot more than we would have because the base flows are a lot lower. So it's just sort of an illustration of how the infrastructure that we have is really set up for these very specific patterns of rainfall, snowmelt, and runoff. So how can we reduce these uncertainties? This uncertainty is really what I can not control, but one of the things we can control is figuring out a way to deal with all of this uncertainty, figuring out a way to shrink that uncertainty bubble that I was showing earlier. How do we do that? Was that a time's up card? Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, man, I'm long-winded. So how do we shrink that uncertainty bubble? One thing that Reclamation is doing and a lot of government agencies are doing is just pumping a lot of money into research, pumping a lot of money into figuring out how to get under these problems by putting in ground-based sensors, putting in, starting doing error-based LiDAR surveys, if you've heard of Airborne Snow Observatory, and also improving modeling methods. But there's also an operational component. How can we operate these reservoirs more efficiently? How can we be nimble and quick to be able to react to things like drought? It's an extreme event, but it happens relatively slowly, right? It's not like a flood that just comes all of a sudden. It's something that we see coming. So how can we be nimble in changing operations? One good example is, the drought contingency plan. Took many, many years to put that in place, but that's kind of quick in the world of water. Kind of closer to home, we work really closely with the San Juan River Recovery Implementation Program, and recently we have, kind of changed the way that Navajo operates in order to try to be a little more efficient with the drought, continuing years of drought that we've seen. So there is some change in operations that can happen as well. And this is just going to be an ongoing thing. And the last thing we could do, is infrastructure change, which is quite spendy. But, there are things you can do to try to capture more of that rainwater and make the infrastructure a little more conducive to a runoff system like that. But there's going to be a point, I think, that we may have already passed, where we can't really engineer our way out of this, right? As an engineer, I don't like to say that, but I think that we're getting to that point, right? So yeah, I think kind of my takeaway is the past is really no longer a good analog for the future. The forecasts we have that have historically done well for us are really no longer applicable for, what we're seeing now. We're kind of seeing unprecedented records. So, adapt or die, right? All right, thanks.